Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 2 of Off Bishop Street, a podcast from the Department of Theological Studies at Concordia University. I'm Scott Royal. Today, in this episode, we talk to one of the professors in the department, Dr. Matthew Anderson. We get into his life as a Lutheran minister, his education. We talk about some of his academic interests, such as the person of Paul and pilgrimage, as well as a little bit about music and life and all that great stuff. Hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you.
So you're a professor here, but first off, just to get going, would you be able to give us a bit of a background, even maybe where and when you grew up?
You mean family or academic background, or both?
Both.
I'm from Saskatchewan. I'm from the northernmost part of the Great Plains of North America. And place is important because, for me especially, and I'm learning how much more important it is, partly because of Indigenous people that I've been in touch with who always say you should start with where you're from, the land that you're from. And even though I've been 30-some years, over 35 years in Montreal, I grew up in Saskatchewan, so when I close my eyes and dream about space, I always dream about the prairies. Some people dream about the ocean. Mm-hmm. For me, it's the plains.
That's nice.
Yeah.
So how old were you when you left there for university?
No, I moved here to Montreal. We're in Montreal right now. I moved here in 1985. I moved here when I was 26 for my first job, which was minister of the pastor of a small Lutheran church in the South Shore of Montreal, in a city called Saint Lambert or Saint Lambert. Mm-hmm. And so it was my first. It was my first parish.
Okay, so going back a little bit, so you're formally trained or first trained in as being a Lutheran pastor.
That's right. Yeah. So I have a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from University of Saskatchewan and a Master of Divinity from a Lutheran seminary in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Mm-hmm. And then I got a contract. I was actually on my way to Paris, or I thought I'd be on my way to Paris.
Okay.
There was a job that somebody had offered me, or was interested in offering me, which was an assistant to a bishop in Paris, of a Lutheran bishop, which sounded really exciting, except that my then wife, my ex-wife, had just had a 3-month-old baby, our oldest child, Nathan, who's now 34, and she couldn't speak French, and she said, "Are you out of your mind? There's no way I'm going to sit in an apartment in a big city with a screaming baby, not being able to speak the language while you're off working all the time." And she was right.
Yeah.
So we compromised on Montreal.
Yeah. No, that's okay. What indications, did this run in your family, this sort of call to the church or ministering, or was this something where you kind of...
Yeah, no, it's not strong in my family, I wouldn't say. My father's family are all Norwegian, so they were Lutheran. Mm-hmm. And my mother's family as well were Lutheran, although I think if you dig further back than that, it's something else. It's probably Baptist or something.
Sure.
But I was raised like a lot of kids were, in the 1960s. I was a little child. And I was raised running around a church on Sundays, but my parents weren't hugely religious apart from that. I mean, they were sort of institutionally religious because all the neighbors were. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, they were. I'm not trying to downplay their faith, but they weren't. There was no history of church people in our family. We were not a big church family. Mm. Yeah.
So what made you become a church guy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wasn't... I think probably community. I went to... I didn't have a great... we had a sort of a rough home life. Mm-hmm. A little bit rough anyway, and both my sister had left home quite early, and my brother and I I left to go to, I saved up money and went to a resident boarding school, essentially a Lutheran boarding school. And when I was there, I got, we had chapel every day. I had a lot of fun with the people that were there. We played basketball. It was residential life, and had a lot of fun. And I think I liked that community feeling so much that I wanted to keep going somehow with that. Mm-hmm. And I thought about other things. I thought about law school. I was in poli-sci, and my brother was at the same time, just very slightly younger than me, was also in poli-sci, and he went into law school, and then I thought about it, and then I went into seminary instead.
Mm-hmm.
And, who knows? You look back after decades and you think, what are your psychological reasons for doing things? I think I liked writing. I liked public speaking. I felt a community in the church, and I felt, definitely I am a Christian and was a Christian, and felt sort of wanted to honor that in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that was part of it. But there are other ways to do it. That seemed to be the way at the time.
And not to skip forward too much, but we'll talk about it in a second. Obviously, you went through an academic history after that too, but you're still a Lutheran minister now.
I am. You can't really get out of these things.
Right.
Well, you can, but I never have.
But I'm curious, because you see this sometimes, that the person kind of, when they're very young, they become, say, minister or get involved in the church. And now you're talking 20 plus years. Well,
30.
30 years from then. You've gone through, various things. You've gotten your PhD. You've taught classes, self-discovery. You probably view religion and God, maybe not, but maybe you view religion and God and your own faith a lot differently than you did when you first became a minister at 20, whatever.
Yeah.
Like, how does you reconcile that sort of, change,
Well, maybe I guess, not to sound sort of, too simplistic about this, but I think my faith was complex enough to accompany me the whole way, if I can put it that way.
Right.
I wasn't raised, my parents were not really terribly conservative.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a teenager, there were people that I knew who were religious, and they weren't allowed to dance or drink or do any of that kind of stuff. And that was not a part of my family history. We were raised quite a bit more loosely than that. Mm-hmm. So for me, Christianity didn't equal a set of a changeable moral code that then I would maybe evolve out of or change in some way. It had more to do with the beliefs and the practice and those things change too, of course, and they have, as you said. They've evolved, and I'm not the same as I was when I first maybe entered seminary. But I wasn't even hugely idealistic. Well, I was somewhat, but I wasn't compared to some of my fellow students, I'll say,
right.
Even then. And so I think it's kind of, it's come along with me. My PhD is in biblical studies, and there's nothing to disabuse a person of a literal faith more than biblical studies. Right. Because you realize that you take apart the Bible, and you realize how human and how historical and how contextual that library of documents is. And once you realize that, if your faith is based on, if it's really based on some sort of a belief about the sanctity of that document, you're in trouble. But mine never was. In fact, even before I went to this school that I went to had Bible classes and a Bible sort of college attached to it, and it was quite. I don't like to use the word liberal, but it was quite critical. I think that's a better word. Even then. So for me, it's always been a combination of, for me, faith has always been more about questions.
Yeah.
And I think everybody asks those questions in some way. And so for me, it's more about questions than any kind of pat answer. And it still is.
Yeah, and I think I've seen this in a few people I've talked to, but if you're Catholic, they would call it the post-Vatican II sort of Catholicism, but this idea of, if things didn't make sense, and this is not to go against anyone's beliefs, but if it's like we can't dance because of Jesus, it's like, well, maybe we should just throw that out, because it doesn't really have anything to do with what we're trying to get to. What's the end goal here,
Yeah.
Some sort of deeper understanding of faith. Okay, so that's pretty neat. So at some point, or how long after you moved here and you were working as a minister, did you decide to then go back and do your PhD as well? Or was it all at the same time sort of thing?
No, it had always been in my plans to go back to school. And about 5 years after moving here, I started taking classes, maybe 4 years, 4 years, so almost right away. I started taking some classes, one or two at a time, and then five years or so after I quit that first parish, and went back to school full time. And I was fortunate enough to get a SHRC, a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council grant, which in the end was supposed to pay for my education, but in the end, it's another story. But it wound up paying basically for me to help take care of my kids during a transition time. So that was good. And so then I was sort of off and on full time for a few years, and then wound up going back into another parish, in part because I needed to make money. Yeah. And it was a good profession for that at the time, and I like it, and so it was always there.
I like how you. We've had a few conversations now where you almost always bring up ministering as like, well, I had to take the gig, like have guitar will travel sort of thing.
Well, I mean, it's not that I dislike the job.
No,
I enjoyed it, and I always enjoyed the community. But it was true that I would have stayed in school had I been able to at that point.
Yeah.
Or not in school, but I would have stayed in academia. Mm-hmm. But there was a gig right there, and they needed somebody, and the bishop tapped me on the shoulder and said, they need somebody. And I had, at that point, 2 young mouths to feed. So that was where I went. So then I was in another parish. And I've never, I go out for 2 or 3 years at a time, or I'm part-time, or who knows what. And then it always sort of taps me on the shoulder, it seems.
People need ministering too.
Yeah.
A lot of your own research, there's a few different streams you've gone through, but one of them seems to center on the character of Paul, the person of Paul.
Yeah.
I'm just curious what it is about Paul or the letters of Paul that you find so attractive.
Well, I'm not the only one. That's a little bit like, that's a little bit like having blue as a favorite color or something,
Yeah, he's a popular guy.
Yeah, and everybody... if you go to this, the Society of Biblical Literature is the sort of, professional association for biblical scholars and others. And if you go there, the sessions on Paul are always the ones with hundreds of people. And the sort of the bright lights, the big fish in that small world are often writing about Paul. Paul is just the sort of fascination, especially of people like me, sort of male, white, Protestant scholars. No, not to say others are. In fact, the most interesting work I think that's coming out right now is not being done by people who look like me and have my background, but quite different by women scholars and by Jewish scholars especially. But what drew me into it was, I think, the fact that if you are Protestant, and especially for me as a Lutheran, a lot of what had gone into telling me what faith is was Paul refracted through Luther. So, first century Jewish follower of Christ, as refracted through a 16th century German cleric and former monk and professor of biblical studies. And so, I was really formed strongly as a Lutheran. And Lutherans tend to be, and I had a very, very strong and tough, but also very, very good and interesting Master of Divinity education, where we were. We had to study Greek and Hebrew both,
right?
Have them both, and we had We had a very fine biblical studies professor, and I did at least 2 courses in exegesis, Galatians and 3 actually, Galatians, Revelation, and Matthew, and. You're formed. I was formed by that education even more than my doctoral classes. Actually, it was rigid. It was tough. It was critical, and I fell in love with the texts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what aspects of Paul do you specifically look at, if there is that much sort of literature out there, obviously, on him?
Yeah, there's everything on Paul. Well, for my doctorate, I studied his rhetoric, and I'm still interested in his language. So, how did he follow the conventions of his day? He was educated, at least enough to be able to dictate these letters, to write these letters. And he used rhetoric, first century rhetoric, in a way that was typical of a well-educated Hellenistic Jew of his day, or a Hellenistic person, whether or not a Jew, of his day. And I was interested in particular in how rhetoric helps to create worlds. So if you think about Paul Ricoeur, say, or Gadamer, and this idea of the horizons of meaning that are created by texts, that was essentially my doctorate, was how does a rhetorical text invite a hearer into a world slightly different from their own? So that if I say, to you or to somebody about politics right now, if I say, imagine a world where we actually, where we are cooperative with each other, and cooperatively we build a society in a way that relies on mutual support and affirmation. That's not necessarily our world right now, but if you have a powerful enough speaker or a powerful enough movement, you can help create that world through the rhetoric of somebody's speech. And Paul, I think, was trying to do that, and did that posthumously in some ways. With some of his writing. And so I was interested in that. And existentially, for me, personally for me, of course, if my life was wrapped up in preaching quite often. And so when you preach, and you're preaching to, 20 recalcitrant, people who are more or less trying, the odd characters that make up any community of human beings, I was probably trying to understand, what is it about preaching that's worthwhile?
Right.
And what did Paul do in the first century that made it worthwhile for him and for that group?
Yeah. I've always been attracted to that idea of Paul as, if people say, that Jesus Christ, at least as a historical figure, was sort of a radical figure. He came along with a lot of these ideas. And if nothing else, we could put certain tropes or ideas on Jesus. And some of them are sort of like Jewish and stuff too, but say, turn the other cheek. And I think, because my dad also was very attracted to the idea of Paul, but I always thought, is it just because he's, this idea of a strong, man who says, you know what, I was wrong, you were right, in a way, that's what he initially, at least, is, most famous for, his big turn of change is just going, admitting his own fault, and then spending the rest of his life trying to redeem himself from that fault. Whether through work or personal, which I always thought was kind of cool, as in this person who, it's almost like Augustinian. It's he's not just preaching to the masses. He's saying listen to this, because learn from my mistakes. Not necessarily.
It's funny because I don't think, temperament-wise, I don't think I'm very much like Paul, to be honest. And I've realized the distance as I've been studying him. And he may have admitted, as he does, in the Corinthians, for instance, when he talks about his former life or whatever, he may have admitted that he had moved from one thing to another when he encountered this vision of the risen Christ. But the funny thing about him, when you read his letters so much and get into his style and his personality is revealed in those letters, is that he was kind of a hardliner before and after. In other words, he didn't really change personality, I don't think. It's hard to say. We only get his personality through these letters, but he seemed to be kind of a zealot of a sort beforehand, and he was a zealot afterward. And he does. Does he apologize? I'm not so sure. Afterward he's tough as nails. He's tough as hell on the people in Galatians, and he's kind of caustic, and he's kind of unforgiving, and he's all of these things. He's not much of a diplomat, really, and so. He's a fascinating character. Yeah. He's just a fascinating character, and he influenced, 13 out of the books are supposedly written by him. 7 of them are uncontested by scholars, but he's responsible for almost half. His name is attached to half of the books in the Christian Testament, and so he's really, really important. But how much do we know him, and how much of what has happened has been a misunderstanding of Paul. And that's so actually I've kind of come back to Paul in the last couple of years, just in the last 3 or 4 years, in part because things have been really changing fast in the world of Pauline studies, and these this sort of Paul within Judaism school especially is really an exciting place now to be looking at Paul and discovering new things about him.
Okay.
Yeah.
So another big part of your own personal research, academic research, is pilgrimage.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how long you've been pursuing that as an academic interest that's outside of personal interest, or writing about it, or I know you've made a few documentaries about it, and so far.
So how do I...
Well, how long have you been has this been a pursuit of yours, either personally or professionally?
It happened to sort of coincide for me with... so it was a former... I'm at the Department of Theological Studies at Concordia, and the former chair, may she rest in peace, Pamela Bright, who was sort of a powerhouse. And she at one time invited me into her office, didn't tell me why. Well, I sat down in the chair across from her, and she says to me, "Matthew, I want you to take a group of students and I want you to teach a class on pilgrimage and go to Spain and take them on the Camino de Santiago." And I said, why me? I'm not, I'm in biblical studies. My thing is Paul.
Okay.
And she said, well, because you'll do it. And I'm still not quite sure what she meant by that, but I did it. And I had never been, I always wanted to go to Spain. I never really had any great desire to go on the Camino. And what happened is that without going, I snapped my Achilles tendon playing basketball a couple months before leaving.
Oh.
And so I shouldn't have gone probably, but I really wanted to go once I had this group of students. I taught the course in pilgrimage, designed and taught it with the help of Sarah Thoreau, who was a student at one point, but then became a professor and has really helped take over that class and design it and redesign it and everything else. And so we went to Spain, and we had a really interesting time. And I wasn't able to walk as much as I would have liked because I had my leg in a boot cast. I'd had to have surgery to actually reconnect my Achilles tendon.
This is dedication.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I walked, I remember one time I walked 8 kilometers and wound up, anyway, it wasn't good. It wasn't a good thing to do in a cast.
That's a lot on a good day.
Yeah. And what happened was that I fell in love with the idea of journey, not so much with the Camino. A lot of people who walk on the Camino are, become sort of, I don't know, Caminoistas or something. They that's their particular thing that they keep redoing because they're in love with that community and with the experience that they have, and it is powerful. But for me, it more set in motion the idea of these long walks, and I think probably that it also coincided for me with a time when I realized when I discovered that I had prostate cancer, and so the idea of long walks to sort of commune with yourself, to find out more about yourself, and to see something about the world, it probably hit me at just the right time. And so I went back the following year, so that was 2011. 2012, I went back with a camera and I filmed people going over the mountains in the Pyrenees, from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port in France to Roncesvalles in Spain. And I just asked them, why are you doing this? I was interested in the motivations. And I made a film out of that. And then after that, walked trails in Norway, in Scotland, in England, in Austria, in Iceland, and then began thinking about these trails on treaty territory in North America. And I've really gotten into the journey thing. And I started writing about it fairly soon after, going to conferences and presenting and writing about it. Most of the people who write about pilgrimage academically are anthropologists, and it's kind of ironic to me that there's so little theological writing or writing concerned with spirituality in a critical way about pilgrimage.
Yeah. like I when I did my other like my first master's, my professor, Dr. Barry Stevenson, he's very into like this is how I did an ethnography, and we arranged it all around the idea of lived religion, embodied religion, and for us it had to do with like the motion of like the actions of prayer, sounds of prayer, things like that. But same thing, same idea with pilgrimage, which I found really interesting. But and it was the same idea. It's hard to find literature. I mean, the closest you get would be anthropologists. Like we had to cite a lot of like Victor Turner just to have the language to talk about like these like liminal moments of, these like obviously spiritual practices, even the ones that are secular. Like I'm just going for a walk. What does that mean? Why do I feel better after I'm gone for a walk? Is it purely psychological, or if I'm a spiritual person, is it spiritual? What is it? What goes on?
Yeah.
Which is interesting, but yeah, I agree that doesn't seem to be so much literature about it.
No, well, there are. I mean, there's a lot of writing about pilgrimage devotionally, but it's a lot of it is sort of I changed my life by walking the Camino kind of writing, which is not bad writing, but it's not critical or academic in that sense. And once you get into some theory about journey or pilgrimage, you get into it tends to be anthropology, like you said. It's based on the Turners were sort of the first, and then everybody's kind of been reacting to the Turners ever since. Yeah. And Simon Coleman, John Eade, and others. Fewer women than I mean, there are some women writers, but it's very male-dominated writing field so far. Not all, especially on the Camino. Nancy Louise Frey wrote a very interesting. Now that was a kind of interesting fusion book where it's both anthropological and personal. And I think there needs to be more of that as well. And
maybe Catherine Bell.
Yeah, and Sarah, to be from this department, has done a lot of work on pilgrimage as well, and has written some pretty good, what I would say is a situation philosophically. How do you situate yourself philosophically when you talk about journey, but also about peregrinatio. She's particularly interested in the not the Celtic. The term she uses is the Eremitic, the monks, and she's really an expert on that.
Yeah, I mean, I find it interesting that like exactly what you're saying, that it's almost like people are kind of reevaluating the religious elements of things because like they're almost coming back to them in a really simplistic way, Like if you took music as an example, I'm sure that there's thousands of things written on like both like spiritual music, like books just about hymns, books about gospel, books about, and there's probably a lot of those sort of confessional sort of books written of like how I found God through music or something, but there's not as much of the stuff in the middle of like why do we feel, what's the neuroscience, what's the theological implication, like why do we feel this thing when we hear music or when we play music.
Here's that beautiful book, Your Brain on Music,
like that sort of thing.
But yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan, and this is what I've been writing. I wrote this book for University of Regina Press called The Good Walk, which I hope will come out next year, which is an attempt to try and fuse an academic, a real solid academic perspective with a personal journey. And there aren't that many out there. Nancy Louise Frey, like I said, did something somewhat similar. And then there are books about, but there aren't that many that combine the theory and a personal experience in some way and sort of bring together these worlds as much as possible.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole the relationship of all of this to Indigenous, to the fact that we're on Indigenous land.
Yeah.
And how does that work? And that's been the direction that I've kind of gone in most recently.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, in Canada recently, at least, a lot of your pilgrimage sort of stuff here has been on ceded territory, right?
Well, not always happily ceded territory. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or I should say, I guess, like indigenous territory.
Yeah.
Indigenous land.
Yeah.
Like, personally or professionally, like why there's that kind of switch of going from these kind of older established pilgrim roots to bringing it back home to these sort of like How does this fit in with a Christian theological professor doing these sorts of things, or like, why do you feel the importance to kind of re-navigate to those sorts of pilgrimages?
Yeah. Well, as with all of the rest of this, and probably as with most people, there's a professional reason for that, or an academic reason,
Yeah.
and then there's a personal reason that I probably realized after.
Right.
You know, the academic reason, or more academic reason, I should say, was that when a couple of times we presented, I remember once in particular, Sarah Thoreau and I were presenting at a conference in York in the UK on pilgrimage. And everybody from Canada or the United States or Australia, New Zealand, they were all presenting on European pilgrim walking routes. So they were, it was a lot of heavy on the Camino, but also on some others, British Winchester or something, different routes in either England or on the continent. And or in some cases, if they were from South Asia, of course they were presenting about that, or there was something on the Hajj. And maybe something on Japan as well, on the Shukiko. Anyway, what was interesting was that those of us from North America were not presenting on anything in North America. And we got talking about this one time over drinks, at night, and we were going, why is this happening? Why? We were a bunch of us sitting around saying, why is this happening? And it sort of came to me after a while that I thought, we're ambivalent. Those of us who are European background, settler Canadians, are, at least I am, ambivalent about our land in some ways because it's not ours, and we know that it's been taken, and it was taken by force, and there's ongoing injustice. And the reason that we know that is that there's a vibrant, alive Indigenous community that's still very much here, despite centuries of efforts of trying to either assimilate or otherwise eradicate that community. It's still very vibrant, still very much alive, and becoming more vibrant and alive all the time. And also reminding us of the history that we've we and our ancestors have tried to sort of gloss over, the history of the residential schools, or the 60s scoop, or the the terrible movement of people off the prairies from where I'm from. So what happened was that we got thinking about this and said, is there some way that we could do a pilgrimage or a journey in Montreal with our students that would be more local? We don't have to drag them all the way off to Ireland, for the St. Patrick's Walk, or off to the Camino or something like this. And so we thought, Sarah and I came up together with the idea of walking from Montreal to Ganawagi, to the Mohawk Territory. And at the same time as we were doing that, I was starting to think about, I was probably flying out half a dozen times a year because my parents were quite aged at that point and starting to live their last months. And I was going out a lot. And while I was out there, I'd always dreamt of walking across the prairie, the land that sort of speaks to me. And I thought more and more about it. And probably it was a way of trying to figure out how to honor my parents and their history on this land.
Sure.
And so these things kind of came together.
Yeah.
And eventually I met somebody out west, Hugh Henry is his name, from the Saskatchewan History and Folklore Society, and he was responsible for a 350-kilometer trail out there that it's not even really a trail, it was a historical set of markers, but it was once a trail. And I suggested to him that I would like to walk it, and nobody has done that in 100 years and
right.
some. And he was crazy enough to think that was maybe a fun idea. And so in 2015, we walked the whole thing in stages. Took 3 weeks, and people came and walked stages of it with us. And the two of us, I think, were the only ones that walked the whole thing. And it was intended to remind settler Canadians of the Indigenous history of that trail, and also to remind them of the multi-layered settler history even of that trail,
right.
and also the Métis history. I mean, it's really a complex trail.
For sure, yeah. And I find that interesting too, like at the prairies, like maybe this is just my own Eastern thing talking, but like for me, I've always been, though I haven't been interested in prairies because it always feels like that, like sort of little bit of a forgotten part of Canada. I don't know if people in the prairies feel like that, but of course there's places with huge populations there. But I mean, you're in between Ontario and BC. No one really knows what goes on out there. It's like sort
Well,
of a
they do.
frontier, you know what I mean?
Well, I mean, a lot of people call it, people in the big cities call it the flyover country, right?
Right.
You
Yeah,
get on
yeah.
you get on a plane in Toronto and you fly to Calgary or to Vancouver.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we don't. People from Saskatchewan and people who also live there, continue to live there, certainly don't think of it that way. But I know
No,
that's
no.
right. On the national scene, it's like that. And the thing is, the history of, it was the closing of what was erroneously called the frontier in the 1900s. I mean, and that term
Yeah.
itself is a colonialist term
Yeah.
because you only have a frontier against something which is,
Yeah,
in
'cause you're
quotation
pushing
marks,
them back
savage or something.
Yeah.
So I've used that term very much, with quotation marks around it.
Yeah.
But it was everything that was happening in terms of defining Canada as a country in the 1900s, the late 1900s, was happening there.
Yeah.
And people don't realize, there have been some great writers. Candace Savage is a writer who wrote A Geography of Blood, a book, fascinating book about that area, which is where I grew up, which is Treaty 4 territory. And she points out something I had never thought before I read the book, that the wholesale ecological change even that happened with the destruction of millions of bison. And what happened, like there was we talk about ecological climate catastrophe now. There was a climate catastrophe that happened in the 1860s and 70s, especially, 1850s to 70s, that ended with, a whole population starving. And because of starvation was then used by the early government of Canada, the Dominion of Canada, to move these people onto reserves and take their land. And it was ecology is woven all the way through that. And we think of it as a contemporary concern, but it was definitely part of what was going on. And the land changed because it was no longer used by this migrating population.
I can't remember the numbers, so I'm not even going to pretend, but I know that Regina still holds some sort of record. Like, there's a picture, I think, of the first two inhabitants of Regina. Like a photograph of European, anyway. And then within, I don't know, X amount of years, it had grown to...
Yeah.
Like, I know it holds some sort of records for the exponential growth of the city,
Yeah.
And that's just one settlement of hundreds around that area.
Yeah. I found out that the town I grew up in, called Swift Current, Saskatchewan, it was really only established in, sort of 1882, 83. I may have the date off by a year or two. When the CPR, it was really, all of these towns were established by the railroad coming through.
Right, yeah.
And when the railroad came through, it was exactly as the last bison were not disappearing but being hunted out. And as the indigenous populations were starving, and as the Métis, who had been, were really are really an integral part of history, not only there, but especially there, but in Canada overall, as they were being first utilized for their help and then pushed out as soon as they were no longer useful. And winding up in the resistance of 1885, the real resistance. And all of this stuff, it's fascinating to grow up in a town not knowing that, for instance, it was one of the first places in Canada where the Gatling gun was used. No, I didn't know that, and it's kind of terrible, actually. Or that that was the spot where one of the generals marched north toward the resistance, never ever actually engaging with the Métis at Batoche, but in fact participating in a terrible attack against a group of mostly Cree and Saulteaux who had almost nothing to do with the resistance at all, and all of the sort of the crimes really that went on that you don't know when you're growing up,
right? And
that we even now are just starting to uncover. And out there in Saskatchewan, just like anywhere, we Canadians are slow to realize what's actually happened, to learn our history accurately, really.
Yeah. Well, they weren't empathetic enough to not do these things, but they were smart enough to know that they were shameful things that,
Yeah,
they
and
weren't
to
going
cover
to
them over.
brag about, or,
Yeah.
at least that brag didn't last long. So, I mean,
Yeah.
they tried to put it in the closet as much as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, these things, yeah.
I mean, it was the largest mass hanging in Canadian history took place in Battleford, which was the terminus of our second major walk.
Mm.
And how many people know, that the largest mass hanging was, and they were Indigenous folks, again, Cree, Saulteaux, Assiniboine, and anyway, there's a lot to say about it, but this was part of the reason why I started undertaking these walks.
Exactly. It's good that this sort of research is coming out because, we have to have people writing about it, at least bring it to attention.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure for a lot of people, especially Indigenous people, it's always been,
Yeah, they haven't
been forgotten.
No, exactly. They've never forgotten it.
And it's always on their attention, but
Yeah.
it's good that we as the
The
settlers, European population, are starting to take onus and stuff.
Yeah, and I've learned so much from. The funny thing is that some of the things I've learned from the Indigenous methodologists, so Indigenous academics, are now starting to filter back into the biblical studies to bring it back to that. Yeah. So, for instance, I mean, it's not if there's no one Indigenous. I mean, there are lots of different nations and many different worldviews and different methodologies and so on. But there's a fairly constant theme amongst Indigenous academics of the importance of place, of land, which when you think about pilgrimages, European-style pilgrimage is absolutely important. The importance of relationship. Who am I in the midst of my relations? The importance of story, of narrative, and finally the importance of spirituality or of ceremony. And it's funny when you think about pre-Enlightenment Christian tradition from the European background, all of those things were important. I mean, it's not the same as the Indigenous, but they were, that was important in the traditional.
Well, I think European. I asked you that before about the idea, because we always say it. I don't know if it's a popular word here, but like saunter. Like I'm going to go for a saunter.
Yeah, santerre.
Santerre, like Holy Land, and people who would just be walking, it's just, and they were on a santerre, Or even the idea that it was an incredibly common thing for after supper every night or after church on Sundays that people went for a walk.
Yeah.
Or, some did something with nature. I mean, it wasn't just to digest their food. Right? I mean, it could be a solitary or communal time, but either way, the activity meant something more than just okay, we need to go around the block, get the food moving. There was something about it that
and people knew the land.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if when I've walked in Ireland or Scotland, and you talk about these trails, they knew exactly, they knew the land intimately, as as First Nations people do it and did.
Yeah.
In this territory, they knew the land, and we've become divorced. There's that whole idea of if you're in a vehicle, a vector travel versus physical travel. You get on a plane, and when you say from here to Calgary, it's 3 hours or 4 hours maybe from Montreal, I guess. Well, 3 hours, 4, 3.5. You don't think about it in terms of the distance. I don't know what it is. It's probably 4,000 kilometers. I'm not sure. But you don't think of it. Or you get in a car. I mean, Canadians particularly do this. You get in a car and you say, from Montreal to Ottawa, how far is that? And you go and you answer in hours. It's 2.5 hours. Instead of saying it's this and this and this. And of course, when you start walking, then you go, oh no, well, you go to the stone pile here, and then you go to the lake there, and then you look off to the right, and there are the highlands, and you do, and by that you get to know the land. And I think that part of our, again, to come back to ecology, part of our problem is that we've become distanced from the land that of which we are a part, and we've forgotten that.
Everything's subjective now. Yeah. How much time out of my day is it going to take for me to get from point A to point B?
Yeah.
Not what are we going to cross and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's funny too, because I think it's I mean, of course, I'm guilty of that, and you're guilty of it, I'm sure. But like, maybe people from more isolated places, maybe a little bit less so because we had to drive all the time anyway. You know, whether you're from a small town that's like half hour outside the city, or your grandmother lives in another town. I mean, everything. And for me growing up in camping, it's like everything was in the car, and this place, that place, and stuff. So there's distances, but there's also definitely more of a like, oh, okay, there's that turnoff. Like, okay, I remember always seeing that turnoff. Now we're going to go up the big hill. Then there's that rock that overlooks the ocean.
So you knew that. You knew the land.
Well, yeah, in certain places, you definitely mark there were still markers of distance, like how long until we get to my aunt's house.
Yeah.
But, I wouldn't think about it in terms of 45 minutes. It's just, you see the things that you always see, because they're never going to change. It's not like Montreal or something where you ever have to, where you would have to worry about that. I mean, it's small places. I mean, they're never going to move that huge rock, or like that corner store that's been there since
forever.
Forever is never going to be, and if they do tear it down, then you go, okay, that's where the corner store used to be.
I know, that's funny. Yeah, where that White House was before it burned down. Yeah, I remember that.
I used to go for drives with my grandparents. Not even, like when I was like even 12, 13, and we'd visit home and go for drives with them, and we'd always go in the nighttime for whatever reason. My nan was a bit of a nervous driver, but like I felt like they knew the land better in the nighttime because they were distracted way less by new houses and new subdivisions. They just knew this is Middle Bight Road, this road, go through Holyrood, and like they knew where they were going. Yeah. And I always thought, like, was that it? Like, was it because it was a bit darker and so they were less distracted? But
maybe. I mean, maybe they could. There's this idea about place and space, where place is something that is filled with. I mean, there are many ways of conceptualizing it, but where place is something that is filled up with meaning. So, in other words, a space is kind of it's points on a GPS or something, but it becomes place when it's filled with meaning. And maybe for your grandparents, when they could drive at night, then the meaning map of their lives, was sitting on top of this thing in the dark, and they weren't distracted by the present changes to it.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
And when my father was in the last years of his life, he had Parkinson's so bad he couldn't really walk. So I would put him in a car and we'd drive around where he was, and he would point out things to me, and he'd say, that's where your uncle had, or somebody had the still, in the 1950s, made alcohol, and that's where the RCMP came in over there, and they lost a vehicle, because it was so marshy, and over there, that's where it flooded the time, and there's where I had a trap line, and there was a coyote followed me around and stuff, and so the stories, I mean, again, to learn from our indigenous neighbors. They talk about the importance of narrative, and that's what was happening. My father was describing the land by means of story. That's where this happened, and your grandparents, I bet, would.
That's how his memory worked. It had to work that way.
Yeah, and that's the way that their memory worked. I bet when they were driving, and if we allow it, that's the way our memories can work too. And it will attach us to the land in a different way.
Well, it's funny to bring it back to music just for one quick second. Like it's funny that even when you look at music. Just say like rock pop, popular music, 50s, 60s, 70s, even it would be, I'm thinking of some stupid stuff like Eaton Rifles or record Edmund Fitzgerald.
Oh,
these are like specific times and places, or, like the night that whatever hall burned down. Yeah. But then it's just like, now it's Friday night, Saturday night, like it doesn't, no one ever pinpoints anymore that any night in particular is important. It's all the same, like.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. These sort of, some people, I mean, I don't know about this, but there's a musicologist here at Concordia who's talked about the fact that it was the digital age that fractured pop culture. Now, I mean, this is way outside my area of expertise, so I don't know. But, he said you lose a common narrative when you have a niche channel or a niche, program, a niche something, there's no more common narrative. I don't know if that's true or not, but in rural places like Newfoundland, probably like Saskatchewan, I grew up with a fairly common narrative, that I inherited. Now, you have to critique the narrative because that particular narrative was in Saskatchewan was, the pioneers coming to an empty land. Well. and facing the frontier in a kind of garrison mentality. Well, just about everything about that narrative needs to be deconstructed, and there's a problem. But
That's the hard pill to swallow
yeah,
about your own history when you get to that point. You're
yeah.
like, I
But
know it all, but it's so bad.
yeah, well, that's it. But I mean, then you go back and you rethink that history. But in the rethinking, maybe you create a new story, which then helps you to see the land in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the same. I don't know, but I imagine it's the same in Newfoundland with, the all kinds of narratives that come out of, being a colony and then joining Confederation so late, and then the narratives right now that are going on around the dam, for instance, the building of that.
I mean, the Beothic. I mean, this is
the
something that's come
Beothic,
out.
yeah.
I mean, it's been around for a while. I mean, in my education, the entire time, like as a kid, of course, it was always talked about and stuff. But I mean, even up until, and it's hard to blame them because I understand, but I think it was a Codco, the predecessor to 22 Minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean,
the
they even
trip.
have, they have a really famous skit about the Beothic and stuff, and and it was all really funny for a while, but then it's oh my God,
Yeah.
this was our real history, and then it became our comedic history.
Yeah.
But it's in the reality of it, and that so you go through these stages of I can't believe this ever happened, to I can't believe we ever joked about this ever happening, to now it's now it's just really, really sad because it's you have no option. It was a genocide, so you can't ever go through these people and say sorry or try to make any sort of reparations or amends. It's impossible.
Yeah, and that's the tragedy.
I think the government now. I'm sure people in Mi'kmaq community and stuff will have a lot of issues with it and stuff, and I'm not disagreeing with that. But I think the government probably has been more proactive in recent years with other Indigenous communities.
Mm-hmm.
On the island portion. I wouldn't say on the Labrador portion, but to try to, because of this sort of thing. But still, lots of work.
Well, there's tons of work for all Canadians, really.
So just to end it off, the only question I have is, we didn't really get into this part too much, but just so people know, you're also, besides being, a professor here and writer and stuff, and a lot of other things that you are that I don't even know about. But you're also, of course, a documentary filmmaker, which you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
You write fiction.
Mm-hmm.
You're a family man. You're living in multiple countries. You're teaching courses. So what, I guess, keeps you motivated, keeps the creative juices flowing? Not necessarily just at say this job, but any of your jobs or your personal pursuits,
Well, curiosity.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's I'm like a lot of us. I'm also curious, and also then you get mentorship of certain people. I mean, my fiction. So I've got a novel that's written that I'm hoping gets picked up. It's with somebody now that I'm hoping will pick it up. We'll see. But I started writing because I love to read. But you love to read in part because you're curious, and stories just are wonderful. I like writing about trails. And I like this particular genre that I'm hoping that somebody else likes it, as well. But this genre that combines a strong academic look at something with a personal, travelogue, really a narrative. We went from A to B, and it was 400 kilometers, and it was hard, or whatever it might have been. But I like doing that because I'm curious. So we walked this last summer in the Whithorn Way in Scotland. And I really knew nothing about, almost nothing, about the territories south along that southwest coast. And I learned a lot in the walk and learned a lot in researching it. And it was fun. It's just fun to research that stuff. And you dig into it and you dig into it and you dig into it and you go, wow, I did not know that, there was this link or that link or something else. I think I've always been a person who tries to make connections between sometimes disparate fields.
Yeah.
And so I wrote an academic paper on aware settler exegesis of biblical texts. No, it's not that I'm not the first one to come up with that idea. And there were Fiona Black, who was a Canadian academic, and others had thought of it before me. But it was connecting that world of learning from Indigenous academics and others, and applying that then to biblical studies, which not everyone. I mean, those can be hermetically sealed in our minds, but in fact, it's more fun and satisfies curiosity to try and bring them together.
Yeah.
So and I'm lucky. I'm of an age. I gave up trying to be like a huge success at any one thing a long time ago, and as a result, I've just been able to sort of follow my interest around, and it's great. I'm fortunate to be relatively privileged, even if a bit poor. And so as a result, and to have access to things like the part-time association at Concordia has been very generous in funding my research trips.
Yeah, they seem like a pretty good organization from what I've heard.
Yeah, and I've traveled all over because of them, and a lot of my writing is due to grants that I've gotten from Concordia University part-time faculty. So I've been very fortunate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds like a good life.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks very much.
Yeah,
I appreciate you being on.
Thank you.